Hello and welcome to this next session on our Peach Summit on Raising Bilingual Children. And today I have now the enormous joy and pleasure to welcome Dr. Ute Limacher-Riebold, who is not only my good friend, but also a distinguished expert in all things bilingual children and raising bilingual children using several languages in schools and in their homes. She helps both families and schools through her company with this International Lounge. She's also part of the Raising Multilinguals live interview series and so much more. Please, Ute, do add to this. You've got a long list of credentials.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Rita, for introducing me. Yes, I would not add more because I think you can find more in the bio, and those who know me know how to find me, and you will find me through my links that you can find on the summit page. So I would rather say that we just dive in. So the topic of today that I will be talking about is balancing home languages and school languages in multilingual families. Now, when talking about scenarios of multilingual families, there are as many as there are families. In fact, I prefer talking about the continuum of increasing complexity. So just to make an example, and here I intentionally use colors and not labels like L1, L2, LA or L alpha or dialect or sign language to avoid any kind of hierarchy. So there are families who speak a language yellow, for example, at home, and a language brown in the community. Then there are also families who speak language yellow and red at home, and brown or maybe also green in the community. Or sometimes they speak also blue at home. For example, when each parent speaks another language and they speak a third one among them. And families usually also welcome the community language, so the brown language in this case, in the family when, for example, the children start attending daycare or school in that language or in another language. Let's say that it could also be the blue language. So when one or more languages that are spoken at home are also supported by the community or society, for example, the blue and the yellow one in this example, we have a rather ideal situation for a positive impact on the overall language development of our children. Their sense of belonging and feeling of inclusion that also Antonella Sorace just mentioned before. And this on a broader sense of the term. But this is, like you may have guessed, not a very common situation. That is why in the micro-society/family, where our children's multilingual journeys start, we want to agree on several things. For example, who speaks what language and when? And in my practice, I focus not only on the language, but also on the communication, on how parents communicate and use their language and languages. Because this is not only varies from parent to parent or person to person, but it can present a considerable difference in multilingual settings. And like Antonella said before, multilingual families are usually also multicultural. So we then want also to find family language strategies that work for us, and set short and long-term goals about language skills, levels of competence our children should achieve. And I focus also on how our children use their languages, the way they respond, what kind of communicators they are, how they connect with others, and how they can combine all their languages in the most effective way. And last but not least, we want also to find answers to the also many ifs, hows, whens, etc. In the next minutes, I'll focus on the how to combine the home languages and community languages in the most effective way for our children and actually also for us. Fact is that we are on a journey that starts when our children are not born yet, and this journey actually never ends. At some point, our children will decide what they do with the languages, the skills they have acquired and learned. But those questions, those strategies, the skills our children and we gain along the way can be assessed and adjusted every now and then. You see the little flags here. These are moments where we can do these little assessments and adjust if needed. Advice like follow a successful strategy or be consistent can lead us to assume that consistency means being strict and exclusive. But real-life situations require that we find our very own balance between this consistency and the flexibility. And it sounds simple, but it is not easy. So in order not to lose the short and the long-term goals out of sight, whenever there are changes happening in our life that lead us or our children to use our languages in a different way than before, when language shifts happen, we should take a moment, assess what we can do to keep our very own balance, very personal balance, hence the a bit provocative title of this talk, because constant balance is an illusion. What we really do is actually rather juggling all our languages. That is at least how it feels like when we use several languages every day in different settings, to different extent, and for different purposes. Now, starting daycare or school in an additional language are two of the many critical moments where we can observe a change in our children's language use, a shift. And in these phases, as parents, we start questioning everything. We question our use of languages, our competencies, and we wonder if the minority language we transmit to our children is still important enough for our child. Won't it hinder the comprehension and learning of the school language? Let's assume that we speak language blue and green at home. Maybe our child is not verbal yet or uses only a few words in our home languages. When starting daycare in the, let's say, orange language, we will observe an exponential increase of language competencies in the daycare language. And sometimes children even speak the daycare language first. It all depends, of course, on the age of the first exposure, but it can take a month or more for our children to understand and reach an adequate level of comprehension. After that stage, at some point, comes then also the oral production of the additional language. The child starts to speak. And here we see a great variation among children, like Antonella has mentioned before, and I would like to refer here to the studies also of Annick de Houwer. And I would like to draw your attention to the talk that Mary Patomale will hold in the next days. We can observe a similar situation when our children start attending school in an additional language. And again, the way our children react to this additional language depends on many factors, like whether they already have a receptive knowledge of the school language or not, so if they understand the language or not when they start the school, or what level of fluency and comprehension they have in their home languages when they start school. Research says that the higher their language skills in the home language before starting school, the better. But does this actually then mean that parents should avoid sending their multilingual children to daycare before they are verbal? Honestly, for many of us, this is just not an option. When families and friends live far away and the only way to take care of our little ones and help them socialize is daycare, the choice for me seems obvious. I wish more research would focus on this kind of families. Now, fact is that parents can easily get discouraged to speak the home languages with their children when these start speaking less or tend to rather react to the other language. So they wonder, how they can help their children function outside of home in the community or school language. They worry when their children don't respond in the target languages. Is it really a moment where parents need help to keep motivated, to keep being motivated to transmit their languages despite conversations happening in two languages? And I know what I'm talking about. Parents also wonder if they provide enough language input in the target language. Parents feel even more guilty of not doing things right, whatever that means, when they get the non-professional advice to rather speak the daycare or than the school language with their children. And this is usually a well-intended advice that points out that the child needs a more varied and richer language exposure in the school or daycare language, which the child often doesn't receive at home. But it is a very misunderstood advice that, alas, stems from the assumption that multilinguals are multiple monolinguals in one. That fractional view of multilinguals that is just not true, and we all, parents, teachers, educators, health practitioners, policymakers, really need to move away from. Now, research also teaches us that multilingual individuals draw on the totality of their linguistic resources in communicative interactions. I quote here a study by Jim Cummins. And allow me to add here that this totality of their linguistic resources is actually the linguistic resources that they use actively and on a regular basis. Allow me to illustrate it with a Lego pieces metaphor that I usually use in my talks in this context. When exposed to multiple languages, it is like we offer Lego pieces of a variety of shapes. Every shape has a function, like nouns, verbs, adverbs, adjectives, articles, etc. And they can be stick together to form something, like a sentence. And these pieces come in a variety of colors, for each language a different color or shade of color. So when we communicate, we stick together the pieces that match for their function, not necessarily their color, and we proceed by trial and error. This code mixing happens to be a great indicator for highly processing multiple languages. And we usually have one base or matrix language and stick the words or forms that we are more confident using in the other language into that matrix. And this can occur on different levels, on the phonological level, morphological level, lexical level, and syntactic level. So let's make an example on the syntactic level. No, Antonella just quoted one of her children, le patate corrucciose. And I have another example here. That is a French and English example. If a child says a sentence like, I like the car red, one could think that the child is confused and doesn't understand the basic sentence structure, the pattern in English. But if the child also speaks French, where the sentence would be grammatically correct, where you would say, j'aime la voiture rouge, it shows us that the child is actually more dominant in the other language, and at that moment could be French, as it follows the French sentence structure where the adjective follows the noun. Vice versa, let me just indicate that. Vice versa, if the child says j'aime la rouge voiture using the English syntax structure, I will know that this is an attempt of someone whose dominant language might be English to find out by trial and error what patterns one can adopt in French, which sentences work and which don't in the target language. In this case, a parent, an aunt, grandparent, teacher, educator, or a sibling would probably help the child by modeling the grammatically correct structure by just repeating, oh, tu aimes la voiture rouge, or oh, you like the red car. Or give the child the opportunity to self-correct by just repeating the sentence like, I like the car red, or j'aime la voiture, la rouge voiture. Fact is that we usually only mix languages that we know our interlocutor understands and shares with us. We do not use all our languages to the same extent and in the same context and for the same purposes. So you always have 2 to 4 languages actually in the foreground that are more dominant in our language constellation. The concept of dominant language constellation has been greatly analyzed and described by Larissa Aronin, and you can see a little model with Play-Doh and sticks that symbolizes the connections and the importance of the single languages for the child or person. I find it a very helpful tool to acknowledge and make our language uses visible and tangible also. And teachers and parents alike can use it to help their children find out how they use languages. It is an activity that is advised maybe for older children who are already conscious about using their languages, so potentially 4, 5, 6-year-olds and onwards. Another way to portray our languages are the language portraits and other practices that, for example, also Nair Ibrahim mentions in her studies about identity and multilingualism. I always try to translate scientific research into practice, which means that I adjust what research says to the individual needs of the family or child that I help. So, for example, we know that the ideal classroom situation, as described by Jim Cummins and many others, would encourage students to use their full linguistic repertoire in flexible and strategic ways as a tool for cognitive functioning and academic learning. This is a common goal in multilingual friendly education, and I leave the discussion about this to those who work and research in this field. It is also something that we multilingual parents wish for our children and what our children need, because otherwise fast attrition of a language can occur. So just think about how fast we all turn silent when we don't feel understood or don't understand others. So if the learning setting is supportive to all our competencies, we won't feel excluded, not good enough, and on the contrary, very motivated to improve our skills. Now, knowing that an inclusive and integrative way to use their languages at school benefits actually the multi-competence of multilingual children and actually multilinguals of all ages, which has been emphasized by Vivian Cook and Li Wei, we should also be able to apply the same practice and strategies to the home environment. Therefore, I always tell parents to make sure that their children are given the opportunity to share their full linguistic repertoire in flexible and strategic ways as a tool for cognitive functioning and general learning at home and in the community too. So as this is what we multilingual families do anyways, I think it needs to be emphasized and encouraged more from all lines of work and research perspectives. So let's make some examples of how to scaffold by supporting our children's languages. Now, scaffolding is a process in which teachers model or demonstrate how to solve a problem and then step back, offering support as needed. So the theory is that when students or children are given the support they need while learning something new, they stand a better chance of using that knowledge independently. And this is, I think, what we want as parents. Of course, we are not teachers, we are parents. Or not all of us are teachers. And sometimes we cannot be teachers because our children want to see us as parents. But when transmitting a minority or minoritized language to our children, we need to go some extra miles to make sure they maintain our languages. They keep liking them and they keep being proud of using them, no matter what language, dialect, variety, sign language, anything that is. So whatever our children learn at school is actually, or in the community, in a specific language and context, is likely to be stored in that language. And let me make an example. It's a personal experience that I had. I learned about Charles the Great in French. So I linked my knowledge about his achievements to his French name, Charlemagne. It was easier for me to make the connection with how he's called in Italian, Carlo Magno. Yeah, so we have Charles the Great and Carlo Magno, another language that I grew up with. But when my cousins talked about Karl der Große in German, it took me a while to make the transfer. It might seem easy and obvious, I just have translated the name, right? But, well, does an 8-year-old use magno or magne actively? It was not in my active vocabulary. I would have rather used grand or grande. So this transfer took a bit longer. Furthermore, multilinguals don't translate and make those kind of connections. We use what we need in the language we need it. So the connections across our language repertoires are made when there is a need to do so. So in that particular situation, it was needed because my cousins don't speak either French, or didn't speak either French nor Italian. Same goes for terms used in maths, for example, like numerator and denominator. This was something that we talked a lot about in our family, among other things. So there we have numeratore and numerateur in French, but in German it's Zähler, or denominatore or denominateur in Italian and French, but in German it's Nenner. Here, the closeness of terms can help with transferring the knowledge, whereas the terms are very different. It requires more repetition. When the terms are very different, it requires much more repetition and use of this context for the term to enter the active vocabulary of the person. I know that with my children, it took several weeks. We didn't use it every day, but when they had maths homework, we tried to transmit them also the knowledge of the terms in German. Let me share another example that caused some discussion within our family when we try to talk about speed and velocity, two terms that in German are not used in such distinctive way. You may wonder why I make these examples. Well, if my children who were schooled in English want to study physics in German, in a German-speaking country, and German is one of our home languages, they will need to know these terms. How will they learn them if they never had the opportunity to talk about this, to explore the topic through all kinds of resources and conversations, not only with me, but also with extended family, maybe friends, etc. Ideally, of course, also at school. What we can do as parents raising multilinguals is to provide a variety of opportunities where our children can talk some more about the topics they like, they need, and they are interested in. And read about them if they are skilled readers, of course. And that is another topic Yoshito Darmon Shimamura will talk in a moment. For our children to make these connections, become confident of doing so, and proceed by trial and error, they need that rich and varied input. And these are only some examples that come up in multilingual families, and I think many teachers, policymakers, etc. are not aware of what we do at home when we transmit our languages in contexts that are not typically home topics. We can't possibly cover all the topics and circumstances in societal settings that the community can offer to our children, but we can choose what is most effective and what our children need. And this is why I like to emphasize that we need a multilingual village to raise a multilingual child. Here I adopted an African saying. The ideal would be that all our languages are supported to an equal extent on all levels and of our languages and contexts. But we know that this is not so realistic, not even in multilingual societies. There are language hierarchies and we all have language biases. Consider one language may be more important, more prestigious than the other, and prefer one language to the other. That's very normal. But we also use languages to different purposes. If my child likes to talk about insects, but I prefer horses, either I learn all about insects too, or I find someone in my community or extended family or some peers of my child where my child can actually share this topic with. Which can be also in language groups. Young parents tend to look for groups that speak the same language to provide some variety of language and cultural experience to their children. And in the next days, you will hear Kat Jeffries talk about this, and also Miley Saitiste and Magdalena Makowski and Carissa Oikonomidou will focus on this too in their respective languages in the next days in English, Polish, Estonian, and Greek during this summit. When doing this transfer of language skills and knowledge, or by integrating skills from one language to the other, we may want to consider the interests and needs of the child, consider the child's agency, the attitude of the child towards this all, which has been greatly studied by Mila Schwartz. What does the child need actually to function in specific societal situations with family or friends on the phone? Do they need to be able to write emails in formal and informal settings? And what are actually our language goals? Also, what topics is the child interested in? We need to create language-rich contexts that provide more background knowledge, like Antonella mentioned before, vocabulary knowledge, language structure, so a variety of different structures of the language, more complex ones when the children get older, that they can practice verbal reasoning, storytelling, literacy knowledge. And when the child should also be able to read, they may need to be able to decode and have spelling skills in the target language. What motivates the child is another point. If it is a series on Netflix or a show on National Geographic, or reading animes or listening to audiobooks, anything works. Carissa Oikonomidou will talk about this more in detail, about motivation of children. Now, we often hear that we should create adequate exposure and when adequate motivation is given, but what does this even mean? Well, adequate is a very vague term and, like so many times, not very helpful while talking about language practice at home. The way I explain it is to find your very own ways to support the child's language development in a way that you can see progression and not stagnation. We shouldn't fear slow progress. We should, though, take stagnation and attrition seriously, especially if it lasts longer than a few months. And this is where I refer to the talk of Maripat Tomeli, who will talk about this from the speech and language therapist perspective. Now, what resources can you find in your language? Where can you find those resources and ideas on how to foster understanding, speaking, reading, and writing in your home languages? Now, in our Toolbox for Multilingual Families that I co-authored with Ana Elisa Miranda, who is also one of the 200 Peach ambassadors, we share 123 activities and games to foster our home languages in a fun and entertaining way. Let me just share two of them. The sound and letter chain is the first, where the first player says a word and the second one needs to find a word that starts with the last sound or letter. Snake, for example, we have here, after snake, one can say cake or elephant, depending on whether the child can already read or not, whether the child knows that there is a silent E at the end of snake. One can also play it across languages, here in English and German, for example, where you can practically every turn is in another language, and sometimes you have even the same words in both languages, which is very interesting. It's a way to explore all our languages in a playful way. And the multi-meaning words, or Teekesselchen, how it's called in German, which is one of my favorite games. You play this game in groups of 2 or more, and the aim is for players to find multi-meaning words. One person chooses, for example, a multi-meaning word that the other players need then to find out by asking questions that can only be answered with yes or no. Now, like bank in English, for example, where we have the bank, where we bring the money, and the river bank. But we can, so everyone will need to find out that this is a word by asking questions and finding out that actually the person is thinking about bank. Now we can even expand the game to our other languages and see if it works there too. For example, with German, it would be bank, for the money, and then the bench. And what about Dutch? There we have a superposition. We have the bank and the bench, the tuinbank. But actually in Dutch we also have another word or another object with the same word, which is the sofa. Yeah, bank in a woonkamer. Now allow me to point out the resources also that we have on the Peach site, bilingualfamily.eu. In our database we have more than 1,000 free resources in EU languages and more, and everyone can add some. So if you have some, I invite you to add more resources to help even more families and children. We have activities indicated in the guide for parents that I co-authored with Catherine Bucco, Julie Carlton, Mary Patamali and Rita Rosenbach. And I invite you to also read the guide for educators. In conclusion, balancing home languages and school languages in multilingual families doesn't come with an instruction or a guide that can be applied to everyone. Like I said, it rather feels like juggling them all, trying to keep those that we need the most in the air. Active to some extent, in some contexts, for certain purposes, and this looks different for every family, for every person. And to quote one of our mottos at Peach, there are no one-size-fits-all solution, but many ways to do it right. So thank you very much for listening, and I come back to the big screen, and I'm happy to answer questions if there are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ute. That was a fantastic presentation. We have some questions. We have time for those, but thank you very much. And I will pick those questions first that pertain to your presentation, and then we'll see if we can find time for the rest as well.
Yes.
So from Rebecca Imberg, she is asking, how can we change the mentality of many teachers of DAZ, so Deutsch als Zweitsprache, for example, who prohibit the multilingual children to use their family language in the classroom? How can we convince them to let the children use their whole linguistic repertoire?
Danke.
Gern geschehen.
Dankeschön. Danke auch, Rebecca Imberg. So I'm going to answer, how can we change the mentality of teachers? I think it needs to come from the policymakers. I mean, like many parents maybe who are following this or have been in my situation where I had been struggling with making our languages be accepted at school. We know we can do as much as we can, but we need help from others. So what I did was to speak also with the head teacher and the EAL teacher at the school. So everyone who is involved with the education of my child, and I try to find a way of having a conversation. I don't even mean that we need to convince them. But I think that what Antonella is doing, what Annika Hauer is doing, what Thomas Bach is doing, everyone who is actually, I think, I'm teaching to the choir here, preaching to the choir, what we are all doing needs to be a bit louder. We need to dare more and to make ourselves heard in order to really make happen this shift that multilingual is normal. Yeah, that there are so many families that juggle several languages, and that's very normal. So I think maybe that could be an answer, but I'm sure there are many, many more that others might suggest, and I'm happy to discuss this further. Yes.
Some great suggestions there. Next question comes from Gioia Palmieri. She says, I always find it difficult to encourage bilingual kids to speak together their minority language when we organize as a school event to help them to interact in their native language. They tend to speak the main language. So how can we get these children who think that they should stick to the school language to actually use their minority language or their home languages together with other pupils?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is the social context. So they are at school and they know the school language is the one that they use with their friends. So maybe even going out in the playground or to a park might even change their attitude towards the language. But it's actually very difficult. We had this at our school as well. We organized lunches in the mother tongues, it was called like that, so in the home languages, so where children could sit and have lunch immersed into their other languages. It didn't really always work because sometimes the children are so used to speak the school language with their friends, even though they know that they share also the other language. So in my experience, also personal experience, I was in the same situation as well when I was a child. It should be in a completely different setting, so outside of school, in a complete different setting where the activity is related to the culture and to the language, and it needs to be something that is fun and not something not natural. I found always when parents came to our school when I was a child and were saying, now we do something in that language, I say, why? I prefer the other one. So but
yeah,
others would say well.
great ideas. Then we have a question, because now in today's school classrooms, there can be 30, 40 languages in one classroom. So Tamara asks, how can we as teachers encourage multilingual students when we don't know their language?
Well, Tamara, there is a practice that is quite en vogue at the moment, I think. There are translanguaging practices, many ways to include the languages, and it's not only using the language in certain settings within the classroom and within the children, and a teacher does not need to know the language in order to emphasize the language and use the language, or allow the child to use his or her language in the classroom. I refer here to really all the studies on translanguaging that you may want to read, and please read our guide for educators, because there are a lot of ideas and suggestions about how to make this happen in the school setting.
Fantastic. Yes, and to add to that, you could also look up Piet van Avermaet and functional multilingual learning. He's got some great ideas exactly in situations where the teacher doesn't know the language, but can still create that inviting and positive environment for multilingual children.
Yes.
Great. And we have one more question here. So do you have any experience with multilingual schools? They are surprisingly rare. How could a multilingual family supplement effectively the learning and development of the child, especially the written and grammatical development classically learned at school?
Yeah, this is one of the many problems that we face as multilingual families. If it doesn't even need to be a multilingual school. If the school where our children go to does not support our language in any way, not after school activities and not language tuition, it's not part of the curriculum. Often it's just the more prestigious languages that are part of the curriculum, and even then we happen to have one of those languages, but we have another language that has never been supported by any system. But that one that was supported is also not to the extent that my children need in order to function in the society where the language is spoken. And this is a reality that we need to make policymakers aware of. Yes, I don't want to say that everything needs to be done, etc., but we need to work together and to find ways to give our children the skills that they need. Yeah, if my child needs to be able to swim, no one says anything. They say, okay, you go to a swimming pool or you go to a lake and you teach a child. Why not with minoritized languages? Another one, to answer the other part of your question, how could a multilingual family supplement effectively the learning and development of the child, is by speaking, always having a good communication with the child, and instead of talking to the child with the child. I know it requires more energy and more time maybe than raising a child in an environment where you have practically all this village around you, you have to create this multilingual village to find an ersatz aunt, an ersatz grandma, an ersatz cousin, so that the child gets the input in a variety of different registers and contexts. So, but I think Yoshito is going to talk about a little bit more about yes, helping with the literacy. So I invite you to jump over to the next room in a moment with me and to listen to Yoshito.
Thank you. Yes, Yoshito's presentation will be in French. So, and thank you for all the questions. Carlotta, we didn't get to your question. It's about dealing with a situation when one parent doesn't understand. We will come up to these specific family-related questions in other sessions. So keep on listening. For now, I would
Maybe I can invite you to ask these questions if you go to the lobby and you go to the sessions, also with the session of Antonella and everyone who is on the summit, and ask those questions in the chat for each session. So I will know what question I can answer in that specific one. I think it's one thing that we have to find out.
That was a great reminder. Thank you, Ute. So I can just thank you so much. It was really helpful, really something concrete, because I don't think this is a topic that gets talked about too much. It's maybe you speak about either either the home language or the school language, but this balancing act, which is an impossibility, like you say, but one tries as best as one can. So thank you very much for speaking to us about this highly important and interesting topic. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ute. And please join the lobby and then come into the next session. Will start in a couple of minutes.
Yes, see you there. Thank you.
Bye.